The Battle of Bladensburg was fought in August 1814 during the conflict between Britain and the United States. Over 30 years after the USA declared independence from Great Britain, tension between the two nations began to rise again in 1807 when the British, who were at war with France, issued a series of orders to control neutral trade with Napoleonic Europe. The Royal Navy began a blockade of European ports from Brest to Elba and forced all neutral vessels to pay duties to Britain before continuing their voyage. These measures had a severe impact on American trade. Furthermore, the United States opposed the British policy of searching American ships and forcing their sailors into the Royal Navy. This situation became more serious in June 1807 when a British warship opened fire on a US Navy vessel after being denied permission to search for British deserters. The continuing trade restrictions, impressment and disputes about territorial waters resulted in the USA declaring war against Britain in 1812. A number of minor naval battles followed, but most of the British forces were still engaged in Europe. After Napoleon's abdication in 1814, the British turned their attention to America. In retaliation for the burning of the Canadian city of York, the British decided to attack Washington. An invasion force marched from the Chesapeake Bay heading for the US capital, but when they reached the village of Bladensburg, they found American soldiers blocking their way. The Americans, commanded by Brigadier General Winder, had around 6,000 men, consisting mostly of state militia. They were positioned in three lines. The first line was made up of riflemen with cannons. The second line, largely composed of Maryland militia, was placed about 500 yards behind. The third line, positioned on slightly higher ground, was made up of US infantry and militia. A group of around 200 sailors and marines armed with cannons joined the third line just before the battle began. The British, led by Major General Ross, had a force of around 4,500 men. With limited artillery support, the British had bought a supply of newly invented Congreve rockets. The battle started when the first units of the British Light Brigade marched into Bladensburg. Their commander, Colonel Thornton, immediately ordered them to cross the bridge. As they approached the crossing, units of American artillery opened fire, forcing the British to take cover back in the town. As cannons continued firing into Bladensburg, British artillerymen began launching Congreve rockets at the American line. Supported by the rocket fire and driven on by their commander, the British tried crossing again. As the bridge became crowded with soldiers, every cannon on the American front line opened fire, followed by a volley from the riflemen. Despite suffering losses, the British marched on, eventually reaching the other side, where they formed a skirmish line and returned fire. They were soon joined by more soldiers that were wading across the river and quickly moved to flank the American left. The two sides exchanged fire, but under attack from rockets and increasing numbers of British soldiers, the front line began to retreat. To offer support, Winder pushed forward the 5th Maryland Regiment from the second line. This move temporarily stalled the British advance, but they were forced back after their left flank came under attack. The British were also able to take advantage of a small orchard to hide a flanking manoeuvre on the American right. Increasingly accurate rocket fire, combined with the British advance, forced the two supporting divisions of the second line to retreat. Now flanked on two sides, the 5th Maryland also fled the battlefield. With the first two lines gone, the British continued on to the third. A small group of Americans tried to stop them from crossing a ravine, but were quickly swept aside. As the British approached the line, they were blasted by cannon fire from the US sailors. They tried to attack again, but were driven back a second time by an American charge. British reinforcements were brought forward and instructed to attack the weak militia on the flanks. Under renewed attack, the American right were the first to break. With the British marching towards them, the American left also retreated. Now being attacked from three sides, many of the sailors finally withdrew. With the defeat of the American forces, the road to Washington was clear. The British marched into the capital city at about 6 p.m. American homes were to be spared, but they quickly began destroying major public buildings. The US Capitol building was the first structure to be targeted. Although the British initially wanted to blow up the building, to avoid damaging property close by, they instead set it on fire. The recently constructed Washington Naval Yard was still held by the Americans, but to prevent the British from taking their supplies, the Naval Yard was set ablaze, including two newly constructed warships. With the Capitol building in flames, the British marched along Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, the home of President Madison. It had already been evacuated, but the dining table had been prepared with food and wine. After enjoying the President's dinner, the British set a fire to burn down the White House, and the building was soon engulfed in flames. The Treasury Building and the War Office were also destroyed later that evening, leaving a trail of destruction. The British left Washington the next day. At the end of the battle, the British had suffered losses of around 60 soldiers. The Americans lost about 50 men and their capital city was in flames. This was a victory for the British. To capitalise on their success, the British next decided to target the city of Baltimore. A far richer prize than Washington. To successfully capture Baltimore, the British needed the Royal Navy to destroy the formidable harbour defence of Fort McHenry.